The sun beat mercilessly on flesh, too soft for the frontier. Bones groaned beneath rope, and thirst whispered of an end. Yet a shadow cut through the heat. A man whose gun smoke promised mercy. Lady Althea Beauchamp stepped from the stagecoach into a world that smelled of baked clay and desperation. The sun hung low over Arizona's dusty horizon, its heat pressing against her silk skirts until each fine thread felt like a noose of warmth. Familiar faces in Somerset had admired her roundness as a sign of prosperity, yet here every grain of red dust that clung to her hem whispered of otherness. 10 maids had once attended her every need, now not a single hand stirred to offer water or shade. The desert's vast silence swallowed her arrival with indifference. She passed under a wavering sign that read, Dilling Company Railworks, its letters fading like promises in the scorching air. The carpenters paused mid-swing, hammers poised above iron spikes, their eyes scanning her as though she were an exotic exhibit. In their curious glances, she felt the weight of centuries of sovereign privilege and the fragility of her gilded world. Each footstep crunched against gravel and grit, a harsh percussion that replaced chamber music and rustled the careful poise she had carried across the Atlantic. At dusk, the sky loosened into bruised purples and golds. Althea found herself at the edge of Ambrose Dilling's encampment, where roughly hewn cabins huddled around half-finished rails. She recalled the solemn grandness of her father's estate. High-ceilinged halls, polished floors, chandeliers dripping crystal tears. Here, corrugated metal and creaking ore carts formed her new court, and sweat-slick workers claimed dominion over her dignity. Hope, once as certain as a marriage contract, faltered like a dying candle in this wind. Night descended like a blanket woven from absence. She secured her valet's cloak around her shoulders and settled on a wooden crate, grateful for its hard refuge. Above her, a trio of stars blinked through drifting smoke from distant campfires. The hush was punctured by cicadas, their chitter like broken promises. Althea pressed her palms to the rough wood, recalling her mother's gentle hands and the scent of spring roses. She wondered if any petals could bloom in this unforgiving emptiness. Her first night in the territory strewn memories across her mind. Portraits of lace gowns, laughter in glass halls, the rustle of servants' skirts on polished marble. In this barren land, such echoes felt obscene. Still, a stubborn ember of resolve glowed within her chest. She whispered a silent vow that she would not be swallowed by dust and cruelty. If Ambrose Dilling believed frontier blood could erase her birthright, he would soon learn that a noblewoman's spirit was forged in iron and fire far stronger than any silk. By dawn's first light, the encampment hummed with renewed industry. Men in oilskin coats and dust-caked hats clustered around steaming coffee kettles, their breath misting in the cool air. Althea Beauchamp emerged from her makeshift quarter-faded canvas tent, hastily pitched near the worksite and paused to study them. Each man's stance spoke of the frontier code, strength measured by grit, not pedigree. Here, titles meant little without iron in one's spine. She had once believed marriage to Ambrose Dilling would guarantee safety, respect, and the deference owed to her rank. But when she entered his office, the previous Evenoak-paneled walls lined with ledgers and maps, she had greeted her with a thin smile that did not reach his eyes. His greeting, curt and clipped, bore the weight of command rather than affection. "Lady Beauchamp," he said, thumbing through her dowry agreement as though perusing a trivial contract. "Take a seat." The chair's wood barked against her delicate skirts. She steadied herself, recalling that each fold of silk represented family honor. Dilling leaned forward, elbows on his mahogany desk, hands steepled. "These rails will cross Apache lands. I'll need your financial support to secure passage, legal bribes, you understand." His tone was matter-of-fact, as if requesting tea. Althea's throat tightened. "My father's fortune is pledged to this venture," she answered, voice firm, "but I expected partnership in name and purpose." He sighed, as though burdened by her naivete. "You misunderstand. Partnership implies influence. Here, I make the decisions. And frankly," he added, pausing to search her face. "I find you wanting." Her chest constricted. "Wanting in what sense?" "In appetites," he replied softly, then louder for the clerks beyond the door to hear. "You lack the discipline to be a frontiersman's wife. You eat too much, rest too long, demand too much attention." His glare was ice, each word a lash. Laughter rippled through the waiting clerks. Althea's cheeks flamed, but she refused to cower. "My body is no business of yours," she said, voice tight with outrage. "I came here to build a life with you, not to endure insults." Dilling's face hardened. He tossed the dowry papers onto the desk. "You're free of all obligations, Lady Beauchamp. You'll leave by sundown." He rang a bell. A hulking foreman appeared and saluted. "See to it!" Althea rose, teeth clenched. Her silk skirt caught on a nail, tearing with a dull rip. She stared down at her ruined hem, the trajectory of her proud arrival unraveling with every thread. Outside, the men's mocking howls followed her as she crossed the threshold. No exit ceremony, no considerate escortingly. The echo of her name spat like contempt. In that moment, the frontier revealed its truth. Here, cruelty wore the guise of justice, and power was claimed through humiliation. Althea's polished world shattered on coarse floorboards, leaving her exposed and trembling on the brink of a reckoning she had not yet imagined. The sun was a merciless overseer when they brought her to the tree. Althea's wrists stung as rough hemp cut into her skin, her torn skirts tangled around the coarse bark. She looked out over the wire fence, marking Dilling's claim rails gleaming white in the morning light, knowing every spike driven into the ground was a testament to his cruelty. Beneath her, the earth was bone dry, cracked like a broken promise, and the heat shimmered in waves that danced mockingly at her feet. Men's boots scuffed away as they left her to the elements. Their jeers drifted back on the wind. "Learn your place, lady. Savor the sun." Each taunt echoed against her skull, compounding the shame that pooled in her belly. She pressed her cheek against the bark. Its splinters bit into her flesh, reminding her she was alive even as death whispered on the breeze. No water, no food. Only the indifferent sun and the endless horizon. As hours crawled past, thirst bloomed into desperation. Her tongue grew heavy, her saliva thick as tar. She remembered crisp tea poured by trembling hands, and now her mouth was a furnace. Flies, black as cinders, lighted on her arms, their touch a cruel caress. She batted them away with hollow movements, each sweep of her hand a reminder of her weakening strength. When noon struck, the heat crescendoed. Her vision trembled, sunspots dancing across her sight like angry fireflies. Every breath felt like inhaling embers, and sweat carved rivulets down her back. The tree's shade, scant and patchy, offered no solace. It was a lullaby of disgrace, a small theater of relief that moved with the sun. She shifted, shoulders collapsing under the rope's strain, and tasted iron on her cracked lips, her own blood from a jagged nick. Her mind drifted to home, moonlit dances in gilded halls, laughter echoing through oak galleries. The world she knew was gone, trampled under the wheels of silver carts and the swelling ambition of a railroad baron. Yet memory still flickered, a stubborn flame refusing to die. She clung to it, each recollection a talisman against oblivion. As the afternoon waned, a new sound reached her ears, distant hoofbeats, steady and deliberate. Her heart seized hope, lancing through pain. Had the coyotes come at last? No, this was the rhythm of a horse, a living creature bound by purpose rather than hunger. She squinted toward the trail, a lone rider, dust swirling behind him, heading straight for her place of torment. Her pulse thundered as the silhouette grew clearer, broad shoulders beneath a worn coat, a rifle slung across a back that carried stories neither kind nor forgiving. The rider reined in, dismounted, and approached without haste. In that moment, Althea felt the desert shift beneath her feet, the pivot upon which fate had turned. Her bonds held her body, but her spirit lifted, ready for whatever mercy or vengeance this stranger might bring. Jonah Creed half-dragged Althea into the shell of the burned-out cabin, its charred beams like blackened ribs beneath a sky heavy with afternoon heat. The wind whispered through gaps where planks had fallen, carrying dust and the faint acrid scent of old smoke. She stumbled over rubble, the broken remains of a hearth. A charred bucket still filled with rainwater that smelled of rust and pressed herself against the splintered wall. The rough timber bit into her back, but she welcomed the pain as proof she still lived. He knelt beside her, silent as a tomb watcher, and produced a battered canteen. Its metal was dented, the leather strap frayed, but inside the water sloshed cold and clear. He tipped it to her lips. She drank greedily, her throat clawing for relief. When she finally stopped, cheeks hollow, he wiped his sleeve across her dusty chin without a word. The gesture was rough but tender, like handling a wounded hawk, and she felt a shudder of gratitude she dared not name. The afternoon sun crept lower, filling the cabin with slanting light that danced on ash and splintered wood. Jonah rummaged through a rucksack and spilled out a few slices of hardtack and salted venison. Althea accepted a piece of meat with trembling fingers, tasting salt and iron as she chewed, the nourishment igniting life in her limbs. He ate in silence, eyes watchful, as if gauging whether her body could bear the simple meal. She studied him by the flicker of light through gaps in the wall, the worn brim of his hat, the corduroy of his coat stained by travel, the scars running white across his forearms like faded road maps. He had the quiet strength of a man accustomed to hardship, a presence that brooked no foolishness. Yet when he caught her gaze, there was something softer in his eyes, an understanding that transcended words. When her strength returned enough for speech, she cleared her throat, voice raw as dried riverbed. "Why help me?" she asked softly. He paused, turning away to open the cabin's single shutter, letting in a gust of warm breeze. She glimpsed the wide desert beyond, its cruel beauty, a reminder of why mercy was rare. "Not the first time I've seen cruelty," he said, voice low, "missed more people I shouldn't have." His words hung between them like smoke. Althea thought of Ambrose's men, their laughter, the ropes cutting into her wrists, and her anger flared anew, yet she pressed her lips together, sensing this man neither sought praise nor gratitude. She folded the tattered remains of her skirt into her lap, feeling the sticky grit of dust and blood. Night approached with distant howls echoing through the canyons. Jonah offered her a blanket, its wool coarse but warm. As she wrapped it around her shoulders, she felt the fragile stirrings of trust. In the half-burned cabin's twilight, two strangers bound by violence and survival shared a reckoning. Her body saved from death, his soul touched by compassion. Beyond the broken walls lay a world still capable of light and perhaps a path toward vengeance tempered by purpose. Dawn broke pale over the canyon rim when Althea stirred, her blanket wrapped tight around bruised ribs and newly healed cuts. The half-burned cabin lay hushed in the gentle light, its charred beams cool beneath calloused fingers. Around her, Jonah Creed moved with quiet purpose, kindling embers in the hearth's blackened basin and stirring a pot of stew made from rabbit and foraged roots. The scent of simmering broth filled the room, softening the harsh lines of her memory with its warmth. She rose slowly, testing muscles that complained like disgruntled horses. Each breath felt like a small triumph. Outside, the wind carried a promise, not of safety, but of choice. In the days since her rescue, Althea had reclaimed more than her strength. She had gathered the shards of her spirit and forged them into resolve. No longer would she exist only as daughter or lady. Here, in the ruins and dust of empire, she would define herself by her own hand. Jonah handed her a tin cup of stew, steam curling over her fingertips. She drank deeply, tasting earth and life entwined. He watched without question, as if understanding that gratitude could wait. Between them, silence became their unspoken understanding. Healing was not mercy but preparation. When the sun ascended higher, they sat outside on splintered logs, sharing water and a single loaf of coarse bread. Jonah spoke of the land's unforgiving pulse, the rattlesnake's strike, the flash flood's roar, the Apache scouts who vanished into night without leaving footprints. Althea listened, absorbing each detail like a map to survival. Then she spoke of Ambrose Dilling's rail line cutting through Apache territory, of bribed judges and stolen deeds, of families uprooted at gunpoint. Her voice trembled only once, when she mentioned the ropes that had burned her skin. Jonah nodded, eyes distant with old ghosts. "He's killed more than pride," he said. "And they won't stop until someone makes them." A spark ignited within her fury, tempered by clarity. She remembered the silk gowns she'd worn back home, their opulence shameful against this backdrop of injustice. She had come seeking a crown. Now she envisioned a crusade. "Then we stop him," she said, voice low but unwavering. "We show him that a betrayed woman can still wield power." He studied her profilely, the set of her jaw, the steel in her gaze. "Power here is measured by trigger and knife," he warned, lifting his own Colt. "But if your will is unbreakable, I'll ride with you." Her lips curved in a ghost of a smile. She stood, offering him her hand. He clasped it firmly, no courtly bow, only the pact of comrades born in flame. Then they gathered their sparse gear. Jonah's rifle, her father's bent saber, extra cartridges, and the last of the stew. As they mounted their horses, Althea felt the weight of every insult, every bruise, every stolen moment of dignity settle into her bones like iron armor. The ranch house lay 17 miles west, a glittering prize of wealth and cruelty. By day's end, she vowed, she would stand before Ambrose Dilling not as a victim, but as vengeance incarnate. The trail ahead stretched through sun-baked washes and jagged outcrops, each mile a testament to endurance. Underneath the roar of cicadas there was a new rhythm, the steady beat of retribution. And in her chest, where fear once lingered, now burned the clear flame of purpose. This land had tried to bury her in shame. She would return to claim its heart in fire. They crested the final ridge as the sun dipped low, painting Tombstone's wooden facades in blood-orange light. Below, the town lay half alive, shutters banged in the breeze, lanterns flickered behind dusty windows, and the tumbleweed-strewn main street awaited the evening stir. Althea sat side-saddle on Jonah's mare, her trousers and leather vest replacing the tattered silk of her arrival. Each mile she'd ridden had shed another piece of shame until, at last, nothing remained but the purpose driving her forward. Jonah guided the mare down the winding path, nodding at sentinel posts where Dilling's men still kept watch. They held their rifles casually across saddles, the barrels gleaming faintly. Word of Althea's disgrace had spread faster than wildfire, yet no one expected her return in such company. She pressed her shoulders back, chin lifted, as the town's eyes-rifle-toting hirelings and curious bystanders alike tracked her passage. The first to break silence was a saloon owner, stepping onto the porch, hand hovering over the rail. His jaw went slack at the sight of her flank, supported by the gunslinger, known only in fearful whispers. He exchanged a glance with the bartender, whose apron was stained with whiskey and worry. Neither man intervened as Althea and Jonah progressed toward the depot, their shadows stretching long across the boardwalk. Inside, Ambrose Dilling oversaw the final alignment of new rails, his emerald silk vest catching the lantern glow. He looked up at their approach, his smile faltering as knives would in cold iron. The men paused in their work, the click of spiked hammers ceased, and the town's hum stilled into a hush that seemed to swallow breath. Althea dismounted, boots thudding on weathered planks. Her saber hung at her side, its blade catching the lantern light in a silent promise. She squared her shoulders and stepped forward, each movement measured as justice itself. Jonah reined his mare behind her, eyes cold but watchful. "Lady Beauchamp," Dilling said, voice silk, on gravel. He set aside his measuring tools and climbed the few steps to meet her. "I see you've returned." "I've come for what you stole," she answered, voice steady. She drew the saber halfway from its scabbard, the blade's edge catching embers of sunset. "Everything you took, my dowry, my dignity, this town's peace." Dilling's mask slipped, revealing fear beneath polished arrogance. He glanced at his men, hands trembling on their rifles. "Surely we can resolve this civilly." Althea's laugh was sharp and unforgiving. "Civilly, you tied me to a tree and left me to die under this very sun. Now you'll answer for it." A murmur rippled through the onlookers. Jonah shifted, thumb-brushing the hammer of his Colt. The hired guns hesitated, eyes flicking between Creed and their employer. The town's piece stolen by Dilling's greed hung in the balance. With a single nod from Althea, the air cracked into motion. Jonah's Colt cleared its hammer, Dilling's men raised their rifles, sparks of reckoning ignited in every onlooker's gaze. In that moment, Tombstone became a stage for justice, and Lady Beauchamp, reborn in fire, took center with the world as her witness. Ambrose Dilling's hired guns formed a loose semicircle around Jonah Creed and Lady Althea, their rifles eased to their hips but fingers twitching along cold steel. The lanterns in the depot flickered across cocked hammers, glinting on polished barrels. Dust motes swirled in the low light, as if the very air held its breath. Althea felt the pulse of every heartbeat around hers pounding with cold certainty, theirs erratic with fear and greed. She stood beside Jonah, her saber sheathed at her side, mind sharpening with each measured exhale. Dilling's voice cut through the hush, smooth and false. "We can settle this without bloodshed. You'll walk away, Lady Beauchamp, and return to—" He paused, eyes flicking to her saber. His gaze faltered, an ember of panic sparking behind his veneer. "To negotiate terms." She met his stare evenly, voice calm yet unrelenting. "I've negotiated long enough, Ambrose. Those terms only ever benefited you." Her words rode the silence, each syllable an accusation that rang truer than gunfire. Around them, the hired men shifted uneasily, uncertain whether they guarded a victim or a fugitive. A rifle cracked at the edge of Althea's vision of Dilling's men testing Creed's resolve. The bullet gouged a splinter from a post, sending wood shards skittering across the floor. Jonah's Colt cleared the hammer in the same breath, and he answered with a shot aimed where the rifle had been. The echo boomed like thunder in a canyon, and the would-be sniper crumpled against the far wall, blood blooming across his chest. Pandemonium broke loose. More rifles rose, but hands shook too fiercely to aim true. In that heartbeat, Althea's saber was out. She swept between two of the nearest men, her blade slicing the air in a graceful arc that spoke of disciplined code. The first gunman barely had time to sweat before her saber clipped his wrist, sending the rifle clattering to the floor. The second hesitated as the steel swept past his collarbone, his eyes widening at the precise strike. Jonah moved like a shadow, intercepting a third man who lunged for his rifle butt. Creed caught him at the throat with one hand, wrenching the weapon free, then sent him sprawling with a blow that silenced the man's protest. Althea reclaimed her balance, heart thrumming not with fear but with exhilaration she hadn't known since childhood. The clarity of purpose found in a crucible of violence. Dilling staggered back toward the depot doorway, clutching at a fresh wound in his emerald silk vest. His breath came in shallow gasps, disbelief etched across sweat-slicked skin. "You'll—" he tried, but the words choked off as Althea advanced, each step deliberate. She planted her boot on his toe, pressing down until he sank to one knee. Her saber's guard hovered near his throat, the blade's tip warm with the promise of final judgment. "This ends tonight," she said, voice low enough that only he could hear. Behind her, the hired guns had dropped their weapons or backed away, their loyalty shattered by one woman's unwavering will. Jonah holstered his Colt and slipped an arm around Althea's waist. "Let's leave him where he belongs," he murmured, nodding toward the fallen bodies and the one man still gasping for mercy at her knees. Althea glanced at the injured Dilling, then turned her gaze to the moonlit rails stretching east and west, lines of iron that would carry new stories now. With a single breath, she sheathed her saber. As they mounted their horses and rode out of Tombstone's hush, the town exhaled behind them, freed from a tyranny built on broken lives. Althea Beauchamp, once bound by rope and cruelty, now rode unchained into dawn's promise, her vengeance etched into every swing of the weary desert wind. Dawn's pale light revealed Tombstone's main street scarred by last night's violence. Spent shells glinted in the dust, and bloodstains darkened the boardwalk where Dilling's men had fallen. Althea Beauchamp stood astride her mare at the town's edge, watching as townsfolk emerged from shuttered dorsum to gawk, others to tend the wounded. The air smelled of spent gunpowder and copper, a fierce reminder that justice, once drawn, never scented sweet. Jonah Creed rode up beside her, concern etched in the lines around his eyes. "They'll bury them soon," he said, nodding toward the bodies, "and the rest will scatter or swear your witchcraft incarnate." His voice was quiet as a prayer, steadying in her chaos. She dismounted, boots crunching across broken glass. Kneeling by one of the dying, she pressed a hand to the man's chestnut in mercy, but in reckoning. He opened his eyes, clouded with regret, and mouthed a word she could not catch. She placed a fingertip on his brow, feeling the tremor of life ebb. When his gaze finally stilled, she rose and closed his eyelids with a tenderness harsher than steel. Behind them, the saloon-keeper wielded a mop over spattered bar rails. The blacksmith loaded bodies onto a low cart. A constable, too, timid for law's badge, stood uncertain, hat in hand. Althea met his eyes. "Tell them no more retribution," she said firmly. "This ends here." In that moment, she felt the weight of command heavier than any rope she'd worn. Lawmen or vigilantes might balk, but if mercy was to survive, it would start with her. At the depot platform, Ambrose Dilling sat propped against a post, his silk vest shredded, face pale beneath a dark bruise. His eyes glowed with shock more than pain. He regarded Althea as though she were both saint and predator. She stepped forward, sunlight gilding her silhouette. "This land remembers each act," she told him, voice calm. "I spared you so that people might see the cost of cruelty." Dilling's lips quivered. "I understand nothing of it," he stammered. She turned away, her skirts brushing the rail line underway, each spike a promise of new journeys. The rails would carry goods and settlers, perhaps more tyrants. She did not delude herself that one man's fall would end empire's reach. Yet the world had shifted, if only at this one station. Jonah fell in beside her as she mounted. "Are you well?" he asked. She inhaled the dry morning air, tasting both ash and possibility. "More than I've ever been," she replied, the words tasting of hard-won truth. Beneath her ribs, where fear had lodged, now lay resolve. As they rode eastward, the sun rose higher, casting long shadows of two figures moving away from vengeance's echo. Around them, Tombstone breathed again, uneasy, but alive. For every echo of gunfire, there was now a chance for mercy to grow, seated by a woman forged in flame and a gunslinger bound by honor. And in the quiet that followed, Althea listened to the land's verdict, that justice, once unleashed, could yield both ruin and redemption. The morning air tasted of sage and promise as Althea and Jonah rode away from Tombstone's ghosts. Behind them, the rails gleamed like a wound across the desert. Ahead, the canyon's red walls beckoned in silent invitation. Each hoofbeat against dusty sand marked the distance between what was and what must be. Althea felt the old lady Beauchamp slip from her shoulders, replaced by something fiercer, a pioneer with scars that marked her as both survivor and architect of new order. They followed a wash carved by seasonal rains, the channel narrow and winding between rust-colored cliffs. Here, Jonah pointed out hollowed-out alcoves where Apache families once sheltered, remnants of hearthstones and scattered pottery shards, telling of lives uprooted. "They lived lightly on this land," he said, voice reverent. "Took only what they needed." Althea dismounted and knelt by a fractured bowl, brushing dust from its rim. In its curve, she saw her own ruin and rebirthed the fragments of her former life, made into vessel for something stronger. That evening they reached a plateau overlooking a creek where cottonwoods dipped their leaves into cool water. Althea's horse drank without fear, rippling the surface in concentric rings. She surveyed the hollow below. Fertile ground, hidden from prying eyes, with cave mouths at its edges for shelter. Here she would lay the groundwork of Beauchamp Havana refuge for settlers cast off by barons, for Apache families wandering without treaties, for anyone trampled by empire's iron heel. Jonah built a simple campfire while she unpacked her father's bent saber and a pouch of cointure dowry, melted and reforged into seed money. The firelight painted their faces orange as she outlined her plan. Fields irrigated by the creek, adobe structures built from canyon clay, shared council gatherings where Apache elders and frontier kin shaped law together. He listened, silence folding around her words like attentive breath. Before dawn, while Althea slept wrapped in a wool blanket, an Apache scout slipped through the underbrush skin coppered by sun, eyes as watchful as desert hawks. He knelt at their fire's edge, noting the horse's tracks and the woman's leather boots beside the blaze. For generations his people had faced betrayal by rail lines and guns, yet in the camp's quiet order he sensed something new: respect. He retreated without a sound, carrying word back to his clan of the Noblewoman who had fought back with mercy and sought to build rather than conquer. At first light, Althea awoke to Jonah's quiet hum as he stoked embers. She met his gaze across the tent flap. "You think they'll come?" she asked, voice hushed but hopeful. He offered a half smile. "They saw your sword and your kindness. That's enough to start." She rose, feeling the canyon's hush settle in her bones. The land had changed her irreversibly, and now it waited for her to shape its future. As she let the creek's water wash her hands, she understood. Vengeance had been the spark, but this was her true reckoning. A new world would rise here, forged in red dust and grafted by shared hope. And no amount of cruelty could unmake what she had become. The sun lingered low as Althea Beauchamp stood atop the ridge overlooking Beauchamp Haven, her hair whipped by the warm canyon wind. Below, adobe walls rose from red clay, their curves echoing the canyon's natural arches. Cottonwood saplings cast dancing shadows across furrows of corn and wheat, while flower-dusted ovens waited silent beside apple trees that her hands had planted. The settlement breathed with tentative life, each breath born of sweat and shared conviction. Jonah Creed rode beside her on a sorrel stallion, its coat gleaming like burnished bronze. "It's more than I dared imagine," he said, tipping his hat against the glare. The road here had been littered with rattlesnakes and rustlers. Every acre saved from wilderness felt like victory. He dismounted and handed her a tin cup of river water, its coolness a benediction. She drank deeply, tasting grain and stone. Down below, a small group gathered at the central plaza, a former miner whose claim Dilling had stolen, 2 Apache families guided by Elder Nanton, and settlers too poor for any other welcome. They wore work-worn coats and patched dresses, eyes bright with cautious hope. Althea felt her chest tighten. Every line on their faces spoke of past cruelties, but here they bent together toward a new horizon. She led Jonah through the plaza to the raised platform of a repurposed flat car. There, beside a pile of hand-hewn benches, she raised her voice, carrying the clarity that had once split Dilling's arrogance. "This town stands on no man's cruelty," she declared, echoing across the adobe courtyard. "Here, law is drawn not from gold, but from respect. We build together Apache and settler, outcast and pioneer under a covenant of fairness." A hush fell. Then Elder Nanton stepped forward, his voice low and steady as river stone. "Your blade felled tyranny," he said, eyes meeting Althea's. "Your mercy gave life. Now we walk this land as one people." He laid a carved peace pipe at her feet, its stem wrapped in tobacco and sage. Althea knelt to lift it, the weight of its promise warming her fingers. Children faces streaked with dust and laughter in between posts, trailing lengths of ribbon as though weaving invisible borders of unity. Women exchanged baskets of beans and dried peaches, their barter humming with newfound trust. Jonah watched them, shoulders slackening for the first time since they'd left the burnt cabin. As dusk deepened, torches flickered along the perimeter walls. Althea walked the outer palisade, her boots crunching on tamarisk needles. Behind her, the ovens glowed with gentle heat, and the low murmur of planning voices floated on the breeze. Each stone laid, each seed sown, each promise made was a stitch in the fabric of peace hard won. But here to stay, she paused at the gate, tracing the iron latch with a rough thumb. Once, the frontier had meant only danger and despair. Now it rang with possibility. Turning to Jonah, she offered a soft smile. "This is the only empire I'll ever build." He took her hand, their fingers interlacing like forged steel. Together, they watched the stars blaze overhead, and in that vaulted silence, Althea felt the frontier's old scars begin to heal at last. Years later, travelers spoke in hushed tones of a redstone homestead tucked where the canyon widened into valley. They called it Beauchamp Haven, though no sign proclaimed the name-only cottonwoods whispering in the breeze and fields rippling like glass beneath the sun. At dawn, the air tasted of apricot blossoms and baked earth. At dusk, lanterns gleamed along flagstone paths, guiding wayward souls home. Althea Beauchamp walked those paths barefoot, her calves strong and skin bronzed by too many suns to count. Her skirts, now simple cotton, swelled gently in the wind, echoing the river's dance below. She paused at the orchard's edge, where scions of the first apple trees she'd planted stretched toward the sky. In each blossom, she saw memory's pulse, the silk gowns she'd shed, the rope's bite, the ember of rage that lit her redemption. Children ran ahead, their laughter like wind chimes across stone walls. They wove between adobe homes, trailing ribbons colored with clay and sage. At their heels came settlers and Apache families, gathering at the open plaza beneath the old flat-car platform that served as communal bench. Elder Nantan's weathered face was luminous in the morning light. He offered counsel and humor in equal measure, his stories braided into the land's own lore. Jonah Creed found her by the water trough, where horses nosed gourds of fresh water and ducks drifted in shaded pools. He tipped his hat against the sun, his weathered features softened by years of rare peace. She reached for his hand, calloused fingers fitting into his like worn leather. They spoke little words, felt unnecessary where life had taught them through grit and compassion. A breeze stirred, carrying the faint echo of distant rails, a reminder that progress's iron spine still pressed through the world. Yet here, at Beauchamp Haven's heart, the land remembered something else, mercy's seed thriving beside justice's forge. Each stone in the boundary wall bore the chisel's mark of collective labor. Each furrow in the fields mapped shared triumph over thirst and fear. As the sun rose higher, Althea lifted her gaze to the canyon's red walls, standing as silent testament to ages of change. Once they had bound her in shame, now they sheltered a promise. She inhaled the canyon's warm breath, tasting dust and life entwined. Here, in the quiet clamor of community, she felt her old self both distant and present woven together in the tapestry of Beauchamp Haven. The wind sifted through the orchard, scattering petals at her feet. Althea knelt to gather them, tucking each fragile bloom into her pocket as if storing the land's stories for another generation. Then, hand in hand with Jonah, she rose beneath a sky so vast it held every memory and hope. And in that infinite span, she knew the frontier would always remember those who dared to remake its harsh truths into something enduringly kind.